1 second. Okay, ready? Here we go. In 3, 2.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. My name is Assemblymember Lori Wilson, Chair of the California Legislative Black Caucus. It was almost a week ago that we here in California woke up to the news that the Supreme Court decided that policies at Harvard and the University of North Carolina that considered race as a factor in admissions are unconstitutional because they violate the guarantee of equal protection before the law established by the 14th Amendment. We as a caucus are extremely disappointed in this decision, as well as many other California leaders, evidenced by those standing in solidarity with us today and the outreach of those who could not physically be here. It was yet another example of hard-fought victories being overturned by the current conservative majority. It is heartbreaking to continue to see protected rights rolled back, the unraveling of civil rights, and roadblocks being thrown in front of the progress of dismantling systemic racism. As California leaders, we remain steadfast in our fight against not only this nation's, but our state's legacy of racism and discrimination. Today, you will hear from many of our members and California leaders. I'd like to start with the State Controller, an ex officio member of CLBC, the Honorable Malia Cohen.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, we have, as you heard, been dealt a devastating blow this past week by the Supreme Court, a very partisan court. And it's been an unfortunate pattern over the course of the last several years. Within 2 consecutive days in June, the court overturned Roe v. Wade, ending freedom to body autonomy and enshrined the right to carry a gun in public, even in the midst of multiple mass shootings and many of these shootings impacting children. This week, we witnessed the abolition of canceling student loan debt. And, you know, as the state controller, I pay attention to the numbers. I just want to highlight for you that there is $1.7 trillion of crippling debt that young Americans, including myself, are disproportionately shouldering. And at the same time, the court has seemed to somehow found the idea that they believe it's a good idea to sanction discriminatory practices when it comes to private businesses choosing whom they will do business with and for. This decision to end affirmative action in college admissions is particularly damaging, as these policies were initially put in place to fuel diversity and to atone for our nation's dark history of socioeconomic oppression. To add insult to injury, affirmative action for the wealthy, for those that carry a legacy or are a legacy family, donors, and frankly, those that are just very well connected, they still benefit from the connectivity of a different form of affirmative action. The current makeup of the Supreme Court and their recent decisions are calculated. They are part of a decade-old playbook which true progressive and champions of equal rights must continue to adopt. We must learn the value and appreciate the long game and, you know, quite honestly, never stop fighting for justice and equality for everyone. So now is not only the time for protest, but also organizing, making sure that we're mindful of who we're electing, individuals that are going to stand up for freedom and that are going to stand up for justice on our local boards, on our commissions, in the state legislature, district attorneys' offices, and yes, judges, all folks that are collectively going to combat these overpowering forces of discrimination. And so rest assured that we believe that this is bad and more is on the way if we don't take any action. That's why we're standing here today, and that's why we've taken action in our own respective districts and home cities. This same conservative court has and will continue to come for voting rights, They will declare DACA programs illegal. They will overturn marriage equality and continue dismantling the rights fought by our ancestors. And as the first African-American California State Controller, I implore you to engage and to organize and to expand our voter base, most importantly, inspiring our youth to pick up the mantle, to join us in the struggle, and to place a stake in the ground for their future, for this entire future of the country that we're all fighting collectively for. As elected leaders, the challenge now falls upon us to find solutions that will restore equality and withstand just judicial scrutiny. And it is not going to be easy. So I hope that by this sign of solidarity of all of us together, we are formally showing that we are digging in, we are digging deep, and we are not going to go quietly. Yesterday, this country celebrated 247 years as a nation. And today, we stand collectively to celebrate a new day. Thank you. My name is Malia Cohen.
Thank you, Controller Cohen. I'd now like to introduce our CLBC Treasurer, Majority Leader Brian.
Good morning, if it's a good morning. I spent yesterday reflecting on the 4th of July. Every year, like all of you should, I read Frederick Douglass, What's the 4th of July to a Slave? Thinking about all the progress we've made and what it's taken to make that progress. It's taken an understanding that the law is an instrument of justice, if used properly. It's also one of the most violent instruments of oppression, if used improperly. And the Supreme Court's been wrong before. They're not infallible. Dred Scott was a person, a free person. We were never 3/5. Bodily autonomy always belonged to women and childbearing people. Our controller mentioned many recent decisions that have cut back on the progress that's been made. We have sitting justices who benefited from the same policies they just ruled unconstitutional. It's unconscionable. It's shameful. In California, we've been plagued with Prop 209 for some time. I come out of UCLA the year after Prop 209, we had more national championships than admitted black freshmen. That's what happens when you don't take into consideration what a legacy of our civic institutions being weaponized against different people in society means. That's all affirmative action is consideration. It is not privilege to have once been considered property and to have worked your way into full personhood status over 400 years. And to see that ripped away now is something that we just can't let stand. We've got to organize. We've got to come together. We've got to push back at the state level. We've got to push back at every state level. We've got to encourage more black, brown, poor, indigenous, LGBTQ legal scholars to study, to pass the bar, to join the profession, and to return our courtrooms to a position of being a tool for justice and not a tool for oppression. And with that, I'd like to now pass the mic to our Vice Chair of the Caucus, Senator Stephen Bradford.
Good afternoon, good evening. And I'm honored to be here with my CLBC colleagues as we condemn the position that the United States Supreme Court took as it relates to getting affirmative action regarding college admissions. And I'm deeply saddened by that position, but not the least bit surprised. It's America, and it's who America has been for over 400 years. And it continues to reject people of color. Racism and exclusion has been the foundation of this nation. And, this country has excluded us based on race for over 400 years. But here's the opportunity to include us based on race, and they're denying us this opportunity. We know the short-sightedness of this decision will ultimately hurt black students who already have to overcome barriers not often faced by their white counterparts. Unequal TK through 12 school system and funding clearly shows us that we're not playing on a level playing field. This means students of color will have to work even harder to secure a seat at the top colleges and universities, not only here in California, but across this nation. This Supreme Court decision will harm educational diversity and hold back students who are unfortunately already used to getting the short end of society and the short end of the stick. This begs the question, is this court committed on putting everyone on an equal footing? Then legacy admissions should be addressed as well, if that's the case. A recent study found that 43% of white students admitted to Harvard were recruited based on legacy, based on family members, based on donors, based on athletes, or again, friends of faculty and staff. Why should the children of alumni and wealthy donors get special treatment? This is wrong and it's disingenuous, but the Supreme Court chooses to ignore this. The bottom line is our young, black and gifted students will have to do what they've always done: overcome institutional racism, work harder, work smarter, rise above, and hold their heads up high as they create a better future. You should, excuse me. No, I'm sorry. I lost my place. But anyway, we're here today to say we're standing in unity with, as a caucus to, let the Supreme Court know and let the rest of the United States know that we totally applaud the decision that they made and need to look at race as it relates to admissions in college and many other things here in the United States. So thank you. The next up is, okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Bradford. I appreciate his leadership as vice chair of the Black Caucus, as well as the leadership he's provided as chair previously over the last couple of years when many of the decisions that have come out of the Supreme Court that have been unsatisfactory to people of color, especially black people, have been decided. With that, I'm proud to introduce the newest our new Speaker of the Assembly, the Honorable Robert Rivas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it's an absolute honor and a privilege to stand up here with my colleagues, with the California Black Caucus, and really to stand up here with them to be a voice for, as we know it, all historically underrepresented Californians in our state. This past week, we have seen these significant developments that we know will adversely affect Black Californians, Latino Californians, and as I mentioned, will affect all historically underrepresented communities of color. And as leaders, we must engage during this moment, as California always does. One thing we can all agree on is that everyone willing to work hard and play by the rules, they deserve opportunity. Last week's Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action will make that more difficult, will make that more challenging. It's a step in the wrong direction. And here in our Golden State, we have been and we will continue to be at the vanguard of this movement for equitable opportunity at our colleges and universities. There's no place like California when it comes to opportunities, especially in higher education. But after Proposition 209, we have decades of evidence that many students of color do not have equitable access to our institutions of higher education. And that is a problem. We know that diversity in our classrooms uplifts all students, and we know that it builds stronger communities. So after this Supreme Court ruling, as a state, California, as we always have, we need to lead. We need to unlock new solutions to make access to college more equitable and achievable for all Californians, no matter what part of the state they live in, no matter what zip code they live in. It's incumbent on us to ensure that all Californians have more equity in access to these higher institutions. And we need to work together. That's why we stand here together. And I hope that together we can achieve new solutions that will reflect real racial equity. Tired of talking about it. It's about doing. It's about deeds. We've got to move. Talk is cheap. It's time for us to act. And you can count on us, especially in California, to act. That is something that our residents, the constituents we represent, that all Californians demand and expect from us. And so again, appreciate the opportunity to speak, appreciate to stand here with my colleagues, and look forward to the actions that we will take moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to now invite our CLBC Secretary, Dr. Akilah Weber, up, who will then pass it over to several members of our caucus. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Akilah Weber, Assembly Member for the 79th Assembly District in San Diego County. Last Thursday was a very interesting day for me. As we celebrated the release of the California Reparations Report, we were all simultaneously hit with the Supreme Court ruling in the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. I find it very telling that the Supreme Court, as was stated previously, did not strike down every type of affirmative action or every type of program that gives certain students special considerations when applying for colleges. It did not strike down legacy admissions, nor admissions reserved for children of college employees. It only struck down race-based affirmative action. So it preserved affirmative action for some, but not for those who have traditionally had doors closed at these institutions. Doors closed not because of their merit or their academic abilities, but closed to them because of their race. And we can still use race as a factor in certain things like sports and in the military, but we can't use them to advance people in spaces traditionally created to exclude them. For hundreds of years, African Americans, Native Americans, and other non-white people were not allowed admission to our institutions of higher education. Therefore, affirmative action sought to level the playing field for equitable access to education. It never ignored educational merit or skill, but it was and still is necessary because educational institutions systemically obstruct access for people of color. The United States Supreme Court has sent a message to students and families across this nation that systemic inclusion of historically underrepresented people to address existing harms and access to education is no longer protected under the law. We have to be committed, now more than ever, to ensure our higher education institutions in California are not worsening the disparities in educational attainment. And we, the members of the California Legislative Black Caucus, have to be committed now more than ever to work with our Black legislative colleagues across this nation to ensure that our higher education institutions nationally are not worsening the disparities in educational attainment. We are ready, and now the work must begin. Thank you. I will now turn it over to Senator Lola Smallwood-Cuevas.
Good afternoon. I just want to start by saying that this is an immoral ruling that is going to further immoral, disparate outcomes for our communities. And it begins with education, but let's be clear, It will be applied to public sector jobs, public contracting, and every opportunity where every citizen of the state contributes, every citizen of this country contributes through their tax dollars, but will not have full inclusion and participation in the opportunity that their tax dollars are creating. That is immoral. And Dr. King said that the struggle to eliminate the evil of racial injustice constitutes one of the major struggles of our time. And this Supreme Court ruling just reinforces that the struggle is real and the marathon must continue here in the state of California. When the Supreme Court rendered its decision to end affirmative action in college admissions, it reversed decades of progress made in this country to foster the much needed diversity in our higher education system and in our public sector. And we know that this ruling won't only apply, as I mentioned, to college admissions, but to so many of our communities that desperately need to engage in the public sector because the private sector has not fully embraced the need for inclusion and diversity in the way that our public institutions have been forced to. This exclusionary ruling was yet another attempt to threaten equity for people of color in this nation, and that threat is clearly evident in how California continues to be impacted by Prop 209, which basically bans mandated diversity in what is the most diverse state in the nation. All of us are required to pay taxes for higher education, for public contracting, for public sector agencies and jobs to do the work of our state. And under Prop 209, we have seen the continued decline, the continued representation of groups, not just in our higher education systems, as Assemblymember Bryan spoke to, but in our state workforce and in our state contracting. Californians have to have fair access to those opportunities created by our tax dollars. And when we look at discrimination that Black and brown people are facing across our state, where more than a quarter of our residents are living at and below the poverty level, disconnected from critical opportunities, we know these disparate numbers are creating havoc and suffering in so many of our working families, and particularly Black working communities. And that is why we are here today to say that this injustice that has happened in addressing and not addressing inclusionary diversity and mandated diversity is going to affect all of our communities. White communities, brown communities, API communities. And I say that because our state, we have a new majority of people of color. And for us to have a system that includes us all, we have to have laws that ensure that everyone has access. And much about why we are experiencing poverty at these exponential rates is because of failed policies and rulings like the Supreme Court, which continue to weaken our civil rights protections, causing greater disparities. And we have a real opportunity here in the state of California because we've had a lot longer to learn from the mistakes of banning affirmative action. And we know that the number one way we address this issue is through enforcement. Because of this rulings, governments will not be able to require companies and agencies to set diversity goals. And we know in the state of California, in order to address that, what we've done is have to double down on enforcement. We've had to invest in policies that call in disadvantaged communities, that lift up equitable pathways, and that strengthen rigorous and vigorous enforcement of civil rights laws. And that's why I introduced SB 16, a bill that will empower cities across California to enforce anti-discrimination laws in housing, in education, and in jobs. The bill is necessary, particularly in light of this ruling, to ensure that now that there will not be mandates across the country and we will see more and more exclusion, that we provide the tools that our residents need to enforce their civil rights. SB 16 has already passed the state Senate and the Assembly, but it is not in the budget. It was not in the budget. We need all of us, legislators and this administration, to ensure that we are investing in our civil rights institutions to do the work that needs to be done, which is to ensure that there shall not be discrimination. And we call on our governor, we call on our legislators who will be working to pass SB 16 on the floor to ensure that these rights are protected and that California is a place where we fight back and organize against discrimination by ensuring that we are enforcing and putting more boots on the ground to protect the civil rights of our residents at this time. And next, I will call upon Assemblymember Gibson.
I want to say thank you very much to our Legislative Black Caucus Chair, to our Speaker, and to all that gather here today. Dr. King said silence is a form of betrayal. And so what you have today is the California Legislative Black Caucus refusing to be silent on the things that matter. Affirmative action matters, not only in California, but it matters in this country. And damn it, when I was awakened by the news of the decision by the Supreme Court, my very fiber shook as it relates to thinking about all the drum majors for justice that got us here, the civil rights battles. And this is just another example of the battle that's before us. And we call upon every person of color and allies to stand with us in this fight, in this struggle. And I hope that the Supreme Court, the six that voted to erode affirmative action, damn it, they get not a moment rest, that they have sleepless nights. I hope they have nightmares to rolling back what we have accomplished moving forward, because it is absolutely despicable. This is not the United States of America that is inclusive, it is exclusive. And so we have to continue to fight, and we call upon all of our allies to join in with us.
And next we'll have Assemblymember Jones Sawyer speak.
So in a lot of ways, this is a deja vu and a humbling moment for me. My grandfather knew Thurgood Marshall, and he knew Reverend Lawson, and they were very good friends. And when the Brown versus Board of Education decision came down to authorize my uncle to be able to go to an all-white school in Little Rock, Arkansas, Reverend Lawson told me that he and my grandfather were together, and that my grandfather said during the Montgomery boycott he would love to have been involved in the civil rights movement, and he wanted to have his chance. And guess what? He did, with my uncle being part of the Little Rock Nine. When I got elected, I told my uncle, I would love to be involved in the civil rights struggle, because I thought a lot of things had been done and there was nothing left for me to do. I was wrong. We're going to need the same type of attorneys, and probably most important, those social engineers that prove with African-American babies and white little dolls showing the difference that people have dealing with people of different colors. It was that evidence that they took into the United States Supreme Court which helped prove that separate but equal was not the way to go, and especially when it comes to African Americans. Ironic, we're going to be back here again with the same fight, where African American children are separate and unequal and not able to live the American dream. And I, like my grandfather, will say, I am glad I'm in the fight,
I'm in the fight not only for the shoulders that I stand on, but the young people that we have to ensure that they have the future that every Californian, that every American wants. And it's up to us to begin the fight, and it's up to you to join this fight as we begin to have equality here in this country again, no matter what the United States Supreme Court says. Thank you.
Next, we'll have Assemblymember McCarty, followed by Assemblymember McKinnon.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm the Assembly member from Sacramento, the capital city, and speaker today as that representative and, of course, as a proud member of this caucus. I'm going to give some perspective on the ruling, California, and where do we go from here. So as was noted earlier, it wasn't lost upon us that the decision came out from the Supreme Court literally at the same time that we were talking about California and reparations, because the Supreme Court says that race doesn't matter. What the report said is 404 years after 1619, we still feel the impact here in California, in our public education system, K-12 schools, in housing, in higher education, in employment. It certainly does matter. And affirmative action, they use the boogeyman terms of quotas and unequal granting of jobs and places in college and so forth to scare people. But it was about leveling the playing field. I can say firsthand that my father benefited right here in California with a chance to go to the University of California at Berkeley, with a chance to get a job for the State Department of Justice right down the street here because of affirmative action programs. Was he unqualified? No. It was about leveling the playing field. And certainly California has had to pull back our policies since 1996 with Prop 209, but the legacy goes forward. And the Supreme Court wants you to say that, twisting Dr. King's words about what the impact of race is. We know that it still has a great impact on California, and we have lived with that since 1996. So the message for us here in California and for the rest of the nation, especially for our private colleges and universities, is look up at ways where you can bring about equality in California. While not perfect, the University of California, through the comprehensive review of admissions, is a blueprint for what our private universities like Stanford, USC, Santa Clara, and the others can do to try to bring about diversity in California, focusing on what we have done with our employment programs, such as our public utilities departments, such as we did this year in the budget with our lowest performing subgroup in our K-12 schools. We in California, through our non-government entities, need to be creative in looking for ways how we can rectify the past. And lastly, let's not forget that too often these decisions are focused on rightfully righting a wrong. But diversity matters in education. We know that in our public school system and in public universities, people do better when they're surrounded by people that look like Californians. And this will have a dramatic impact on private universities and across the nation in making sure that classrooms look like California. Because students can't learn, they don't have people in the real world with them. So that is something that we need to press on with, and certainly glad that the California legislature is going to step up to the challenge and work for the best of California. Thank you. Next, I would like to introduce my colleague from Southern California, Assemblymember McKinnon.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Tina McKinnon, and I represent Assembly District 61 in LA County. The Supreme Court's ruling affirmative action sends a clear message to our leadership that we must do all we can do to create legislation that better protects civil rights of California, particularly our Black and brown residents. Legislation like SB 16, this bill authored by Senator Smallwood Cuevas, would more effectively protect Californians by enforcing anti-discrimination laws at the local level. I joined Senator Smallwood Cuevas in calling on the governor to stand with us to get SB 16 in the budget and signed into law. Look, my dad, we're from Texas. My family is from Texas. My parents came here for a better life for their children. Because of affirmative action, he was able to work for the film industry and my mom for the television industry. As we've seen those numbers decline, we know that we need affirmative action. We need to make sure that there's inclusion in California. And so I stand with my colleagues to make sure that that happens, to make sure that we have comprehensive legislation to combat discrimination. Thank you. Next is Assemblymember Bonta. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm Assemblymember Bonta, AD 18, representing the people of Oakland, Alameda, and Emeryville. And I'm here to, in some ways, just mark that the California Legislative Black Caucus is standing strong in our resolve to be able to move forward in light of the Supreme Court's decision. And I think you've heard from our colleagues that we are willing and able and will take on all of the issues impacting California. I want to also just recognize that we've called in several of our leaders throughout the state of California to stand with us because this is the first of many calls that will happen. We will ask if they want to be able to make some remarks to feel free to come up, and then we will close out with some questions that we will field together. I did want to just share a personal story with what happened to me on Thursday when I heard of when the Supreme Court ruling came down. I graduated from high school in 1989. I was at the top of my class in New York City. Many days I went to school a bit more hungry than I should have after traveling an hour and a half each day, going home to a mother who had to work several jobs in order to make sure that we had enough money to put on the table. I happened to get accepted to 11 colleges, including Yale and Harvard and Brown, many Ivies, and many private institutions along the way. When I received my admission to Harvard in particular, I beat out somebody who felt like he belonged. He was entitled to be there. And I heard him say, "Oh, it was because of affirmative action that she got there." Now that was BS, and I knew it in my heart. But let me tell you what affirmative action meant, because I did go on to go to Yale, to those Ivies, and I walked those streets. Every single day when I was there, I had signals that told me that that level playing field that was supposed to be afforded to me was still so shaky that sometimes we couldn't stand together. I walked by almost every single day on my way to Psychology 101, looking at a stained glass window in that institution that was supposed to be diversified because of my so-called existence because of affirmative action. Every day walked by a stained glass window of a slave shackled, eating watermelon. I did not belong there. Black community, Latino community, underrepresented members of the API community did not belong there. And this is where we are with affirmative action. So this decision of the Supreme Court is wrong. We are not in a state of colorblindness. We are in a state of still having to recognize and deal with the legacy of slavery, deal with the legacy of oppression that we have to face every single day in the state of California and throughout this country. So this wrong-headed decision has absolute impacts for this nation, but know this, in the state of California, we will do what we always do so that we can lead the nation. In the state of California, we will take the amazing work that we stand on with this reparations task force and the work that has been led by our Secretary of State, Shirley Weber, our Senator Bradford, and Assemblymember Reggie Jones-Sawyer. We will lead in making sure that those wrongs are righted. And we will not take the decision of a corrupt and biased Supreme Court in this moment. Together we will stand. With that, I would like to introduce our leaders in our community who stand with us today. And I will start with our former colleague, former Assemblymember Sandra Swanson.
Yes. Thank you. Very moving.
Thank you very much. Sandre Swanson, I was representing the cities of Oakland, Alameda, and Piedmont. And I joined today because it's very important that the nation know that we have an activist court and that this is probably the beginning of a new era in our struggle for civil rights. But the message, as I associate myself with everything that's been said today, the message that I think is important to be received by more than just the community of color. Because when we talk about diversity, sometimes that word is not clearly defined for the general public. The fact of the matter is that diversity has led to tremendous accomplishments over history. We've had science advances because of diversity, educational advances because of diversity, health advantages because of diversity. And so it's not just the African American community or the Hispanic community that's losing here. Without the advancement of these students, the United States, the intellectual properties of the United States suffer from a lack of diversity. And so this is in everyone's interest to make sure that the opportunities are from a level playing field and these qualified students are able to reach their full potential, and the benefit will be the general public. Thank you very much.
Yeah. We'll have a short statement from Latifah Simon, elected leader in the East Bay.
My name is Latifah Simon. I'm an elected board member for Bay Area Rapid Transit and also a trustee for the California State University. I want to thank the Black Caucus for bringing us all together. In fact, this room should have been completely full, that every single sitting member of the state legislature should be behind these brave men and women who, even in their own positions, know that every room that they walk into, even as electeds, they are oftentimes not welcomed. The audacious decision from the United States Supreme Court proves one thing, that this activist court took it upon themselves to rewrite what we have all worked so hard for, systems of equity and justice. But let me say, before I end my comments, California has a long way to go. The California State University system, only 5% of its 500,000 student body are African American. You know what that means for public contracting? For Bay Area Rapid Transit, because of 209, our anti-affirmative action policies, we are still flooding contractors with hundreds of millions of dollars, which continues the wealth of folks who started off with privilege. This caucus will continue not only to fight the national fight and be up in front, but California must do better. California State University at Berkeley, 3% African American. Stanford University, 13% African American. Why? Because Stanford was able to go and find those amazing students both in the fields of California and in cities like Macon, Georgia, and Detroit. And because of that, the doctors who will save your life may look like you. We have a long way to go, and I want to thank the Black Caucus for standing with us to ensure that the fight has not just began, it never ended. Let's go.
And just quickly, we'll have Portia Middleton, if she chooses, and Monica Wilson, and then we'll end with any questions.
I'm Portia Middleton. I'm a councilwoman in Citrus Heights, right here in Sacramento County. My grandparents picked cotton and tobacco, and they would be dismayed to see that the work that they did to fight for affirmative action has been dismantled. I have two boys who, when I woke up on Thursday, I was deeply concerned about what their education and the education of my community was going to look like. I stand here with the Black Caucus and with all communities of color to fight this fight, and we will change the system.
Good afternoon. My name's Monica Wilson. I'm a council member in the city of Antioch. I come here today in support of the Black Caucus. I dropped everything to be up here to be in solidarity and unity with this caucus. About 7 years ago, when I saw what the change in the Supreme Court, I told my colleagues, we're on the slippery slope. This is a slippery slope we're going on, and as they take things away, more and more from communities that are underserved, underrepresented and under-resourced. We need to do something. So I come up here today, stand in solidarity, in unity. I will fight on the local level in solidarity with you. I'm here to fight. I highly suggest and strongly suggest and urge all of our colleagues of color, Black, white, Latino, everybody to stand up and challenge this and fight very hard. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words.
Thank you, and that concludes formally the press conference of the California Legislative Black Caucus denouncing the recent SCOTUS decision on affirmative action and standing together in unity. If there are any questions, we can take them now.
We have one question, maybe two, but I'll ask this first one. How will the California Legislative Black Caucus work with other lawmakers to develop new policies aimed at reducing student debt, despite the Supreme Court decision? I know you and the Attorney General has spoken many times on student debts by experience and stuff. So, do you have anything to offer?
I'm going to defer to my colleague who is, well, actually both of you, but go ahead. Yeah. You go ahead.
On the federal existing debt, California really can't step in, but we're trying to reduce debt in the first place. We have a debt-free college initiative that we're funding about a third of it so far, that the governor has been talking about going forward in California to prevent students who have debt in the first place. If you look who has student debt, disproportionately African Americans. Not enough African Americans, as Latifah said, in the CSU and UC system, but the student debt threshold for African Americans disproportionately among all other students. And so we're trying to make it so students have their financial aid for tuition, but also cover things like housing, books, food, transportation, so they can graduate without student debt. So it's a priority of the budget process, and we're working at that every year, including this year.
I would also say and refer you also to the recommendations of the Reparations Task Force, who makes it one of its own recommendations to ensure that higher education is not only affordable but even free from descendants of slaves. And so it is our sacred responsibility to implement the recommendations of the Reparations Task Force, and certainly that's one of the recommendations that we intend to act on.
And speaking with the Reparations Task Force recommendations that came out last Thursday, we haven't gotten through the 1,100 pages just yet, but it's my understanding that the Black press is not mentioned in there. And so that is something that is extremely concerning, I think, obviously, to Black media publishers and owners throughout the state, obviously, because there's legislation actually right now that is working its way through the Senate to fundamentally change how journalism and how people get paid through journalism. And with that, if you don't have recommendations on how it's going to impact, the very people who we're trying to reach every day, how will the caucus maybe try to figure out how to remedy that? Since if somebody wasn't included or if the sector wasn't included, will we be able to still work with the caucus on recommendations? Kind of like an addendum.
Well, thank you very much for bringing that up. I think one thing is clear in the Reparations Task Force recommendations is that we have to build more Black institutions, and certainly the Black press is one of those institutions. And the idea that we need to make sure that we have more Black businesses, Black serving organizations, the introduction of the Freedmen's Bureau, all of those things is really about we need to make sure that we not just have Black programs, but we have Black organizations and turn those Black organizations into Black institutions in our community. And certainly there's been, from the very beginning, the Black press being a part of that. And certainly we'll make sure that that's not left out. And of course, we'll work with the Black press to making sure and continue to remind us to making sure that our Black press is strong.
Thank you so much for your time today. We'll stand together. We will change what we need to in the state of California.
Thank you.